the volume, and then I will click record so I don't forget that part too. There's a lot of little buttons to click to get this whole thing going. Okay, so it's up live. We're gonna turn the volume off so that's not a distraction, and we are turning on record. Let's see what happens there. We should be recording. Double check that. Let's see. Yes, here we go. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good wherever you are. I hope you've had a good one or you're about to have a good one. I always love doing this show. When I'm recording it, it's the morning for me. So welcome to Your Message Matters. I'm your host, Lori Raupe, and I am a #1 international best-selling author, coach, and the founder of the Butterfly Publishing Company. And I am so grateful you're here. Today, we are going to be looking at my top 10 do's and don'ts for impactful writing. We've been talking a little bit more about how to get your book done. Of course, we're always talking about nonfiction books, but the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about actually the writing part of it and things that you should keep in mind as you are writing. So I've got my insider secrets, and these are the ones that I believe you really need to know to really create your masterpiece. And do you believe your book is a masterpiece? You see, I really do. And I think sometimes we need to embrace what we've been through, what we know, and what we're going to write about in our book. Claim that masterpiece because it's not just a manuscript. It is your story that's going to make an impact, that will inspire others for transformation. So today we're going to look at what I'm calling my top 10 tips. They're really do's and don'ts of writing and making sure your book is the best it can be. Here we go. So these are not in any particular order. They're just kind of how they came to me. So I wouldn't say this first one is any more important or any less important than any of the other ones I'm going to tell you about today. But it's something that happened recently. I'm helping a wonderful gentleman. He's reliving, actually, and it's been kind of a hard journey for him. He was telling me last Friday. He's writing about his time in the Vietnam War. So you can imagine that brings up a little PTSD, right? But what I was reminded of when I was helping him write his book is don't use specific jargon that is specific to your story. Now, here's the thing. I say that it's a little tongue-in-cheek because if your perfect fit reader is going to know this jargon and relate to it, make sure that you put your special verbiage in there, but you may also want to explain a little bit further for those people who may not know what you're talking about. So one of the terms he uses is incoming. And so I'm reading his stories and he's talking about incoming, and I'm thinking, incoming what? And then it goes on to talk about what happens after there is incoming, or you can hear the incoming. And I was lost at first and then realized he's talking about the mortars and rockets and bullets and things that are incoming that's threatening his life. Well, you could see how that may not work too well if somebody has no idea what incoming is, like me. I didn't know what it was at first. Of course, the more I read, the more I realized what he was talking about. But you can write that a little more specifically and a little bit differently and have the same effect. So if you have specific jargon or language that's specific to what you do, how you do it, or explaining your life story. I know this comes up a lot too when I worked for Department of Corrections. It is a paramilitary organization. So this whole Vietnam vet thing, I felt equipped to help him dissect some of his verbiage. However, we didn't have incoming. Incoming to us was inmates coming into the system. So that wouldn't work. Anyway, you got the idea. You really want to talk to your reader and make sure that you're explaining in those certain areas that you might need to explain just a little bit more. It really may only be a sentence or two to really get your point across. So don't tell every detail of your story or get too wordy or beat around the bush with kind of some mystery or things. This is a really important part. Um, I read a lot of books, as you can imagine. I get requests to read books for reviews. I get requests just to read books. Would you read my book? And I don't have that much time because my clients that have hired me to read their books really take my first priority as they should. But I do read a lot of these stories, as many as I possibly can, so that I can help people. Because if you know me, you know one of the biggest missions of my life has been to help people get their books done. And whether you do business with me or not, I still want to help. And I appreciate the fact, and it's honoring to me that people would even ask me to look at their manuscript. And I find this to be true sometimes. So a lot of people are are talking about a trauma that they've been through. I've helped several people write their stories about the things that traumatize them in life. I was thinking about one of my authors who wrote about her childhood and what she didn't get that most kids do get. And she minimized this her whole life. She didn't realize that she had suffered what some would call abuse, but not in the traditional terminology that we think of. Her parents didn't intentionally hurt her. They didn't, you know, beat her. There was no traditional type of abuse in her home, but neglect is abuse. And in her case, she was neglected with her basic needs sometimes. You don't need to focus on the minute details of the things that you're talking about. And may I also say, especially if part of your story is like many of ours, where you have sexual abuse, you don't want to go into the details of that abuse. Saying things very top of the wave, get your point across without re-traumatizing your reader. I see this a lot. People will go into great detail about what has happened to them rather than going into the great detail of how you can help them if they've suffered like you have. The focus is always on the solution, the results, what you can do for them. That's the reader focus, not on your victimization of all of the things in your lifetime that have affected you. I know when I talk to people sometimes, they have asked me why I didn't write about certain aspects of my life. You can imagine how easy it would be if I wrote a book and I started out with, the whole idea of sexual abuse, going on to being married to somebody with mental health issues and being traumatized within that atmosphere of being married to somebody who I now believe was a narcissist, and how that impacted me and how my personality changed. In fact, I'm helping a young woman right now write her story of escaping her abuser. Well, when you're talking about your story, there's different ways to present it, and there's different kinds of books that address these things. But if I then went on to talk about the death of my daughter, being remarried, and losing my home and all of my belongings, I'm like, I feel overwhelmed just saying those things. I wouldn't want to write about all of them in one book. So the point here is your stories may be more than one book. I could easily write an entire book about my childhood, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I could easily write a lot about my first marriage and all that happened there. I could easily write about grief, which actually I am writing about right now. And it's been a journey for me to go back into some of those whew, dark places of my life to pull out what I need to share, not because I'm trying to heal myself, but because I want to help somebody who's there right now. That's the difference. So I could have easily multiple books and talk about these different aspects. So as you're writing, if you're writing a lot about a lot of different things that have happened in your life, think about it being more than one book. As you may know, short read books are read much more than longer books, depending on the genre, depending on your ideal reader, and depending on your tribe. But you will find a lot of people love to pick up a quick read because they can read it in an afternoon or a day, and they feel like they've accomplished something when they complete the book. Nobody wants a book sitting on the nightstand for years because they can't get back to reading it, or it's so long that they lose interest. We don't want those things to happen. Let's see. One of the other things that I think, especially now with AI tools, is using verbiage that is not your verbiage. So don't use things that are real flowery, unless that's how you talk, or real glittery kind of language that really embellishes things. Use your conversational words, the ones that you would normally use. And so if you're using AI tools and those tools are changing your words or making suggestions to use words differently, definitely take a look at the suggestions, because sometimes in our own vernacular, we use words wrong or incorrectly. The meaning of that word really doesn't fit. I'm finding that in one of the books I'm reading right now. It's like I'm reading along and all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, what does she mean by this word? This does not seem like the correct word for the sentence or for the paragraph that it's in. So those things are really important to take note of as well. Don't exaggerate how bad your life was. You don't have to make it worse than it was. You can just tell the honest truth, because that is what will really pull your reader in. You don't have to make it horrible. You don't have to make it anything other than truthfully what it was. I find in some people's writings that I've had to look at, that they feel that because they feel their story isn't powerful enough, they embellish it to such a degree that it's not really even the truth anymore. So do watch for that as well. You are on a hero's journey. You are going to have your ups, you're going to have your downs. Don't paint a picture at the end of your book that paints you in such a light that you have it all figured out, that you have the solution, that you are not learning anymore on this topic because you're done with it. You've learned all there is that you can learn. I think most of us have new epiphanies on our life and the things that we've been through all the time. I have learning sort of epiphanies constantly. I guess because I read so much and I listen to podcasts so much and watch YouTube a lot, I often think, wow, this just happened to me last week. I was watching a YouTube video and I can't even remember as I'm sitting here what exactly I learned. But when it was said, I was like, wow, I wish I had said that. because it made it so it was Sunday morning. I got to go back to my notes now and figure out what that was so I can meditate on that a little bit more. You don't have to paint your picture. You don't have to paint a perfect picture because most of us are not perfect. We are still human. We are still learning. We still have good days, bad days, and some that are downright ugly. And it's okay. Paint the true and accurate picture. The one thing I remember thinking a few years after my first book was finished is, man, I wish I could rewrite this because 2 years out or 3 years out or 5 years out, I feel like I'm a different person today. And when I go back and read some of the things that I wrote, I thought, oh, I remember when I was in that part of my life and learning those things. But now I feel like I've evolved even further. That is the hard part about writing a book, is it is a snapshot of where you are the day you close that book. As soon as you publish it, unless you revise it, you're kind of at the end of that story. But don't make it perfect. Don't seek perfection. Just seek the truth. Another aspect of working on your book and telling your story, something that is very helpful, I think, is creating a timeline. So do create a timeline. It will really help anybody that's going to help you with your book, but it'll help you too. In fact, I kind of go back a little bit to those multiple stories one could tell in their lifetime. If you plot those stories out, and to tell you the truth, it will reveal some things that you may need to still heal. When you revisit it, you'll find you still have some wounds. I know when I have done this multiple times as a coach, I sometimes ask my clients to go through the timeline. That is a neurologic type technique to help people walk back into their life so that they can walk out of it differently. When you do your timeline, you can see your successes. You can relive some of the trauma, but know that it's healing and not worry so much. If you have a moment and you cry, or if you need to speak to somebody, do those things. But I think it's very cathartic and healing to walk back and see how far you've come. A lot of times people will say to me, when I do this, I realize I have another book in me. And it's true. Many of us do. Most people who write a book will write another book at some point. And while they're writing their first book, they're realizing there's so much more to share. So doing the timeline will kind of help you put things in frames, if you will, and have them individual type things, which could be multiple books. It's a good thing to tell your story, tell it succinctly, and create a transformation for your reader. It's hard if you are confusing them with multiple things and going in 100 different directions. Which brings me to another don't. Don't assume your reader knows everything you know. Go to the basics of what you learned in the beginning. I say this because so often we've gone through different pathways to learn things. We use our own jargon as we learn more about whatever we do. I know this is very true when it comes to like coaching. One of the examples that pops into my mind when you're talking about coaching or having somebody go through a journey or a mental challenge, they may have what's called a breakthrough. What does that really mean? What is a breakthrough? That's language that is common in coaching circles, but may not be common to your reader. So go back to the basics and explain what is a breakthrough. What does that look like? How does it change your life? They want to know the basics, not necessarily what you've learned and how you would speak of it today. So don't forget to do that, because I know often when I'm in circles of people that are talking about their particular expertise, they talk about it in terms of a particular language. And you want your book to be life-changing. You want your reader to see your authenticity, but also where you started, because you didn't start where you are today. You started back when you didn't know what a breakthrough was, or you didn't know whatever that thing was that you know today. So when you go back to the basics and explain things along the way in layman terms so that anybody would understand what you're talking about, you're going to find you will have a much greater impact than you would if you speak in a way that goes over their head, if that makes sense. You definitely don't want to do that. I know this is a mistake that I've made myself. Being in the publishing field and also being a coach, I sometimes feel that people know all the things that I know about these things, and they don't. I was talking to somebody just recently, and I made this mistake myself, which is why I'm warning everybody else about it. Don't talk in a way that you're losing the person that you want to help the most. So one other thing that I think kind of goes along the same line is you want to be a person's guide. You want to know a little bit more or be further along in the path than they are, but you want to be the friend, the confidant that is guiding them through a special journey. So if you're too preachy, for example, if you're kind of on the pulpit and being on a rant or rave or, really speaking to them instead of guiding with them, you're going to find you may lose people. It's good to know your business, and it is definitely good to explain it and help people make transformations. But when you are, I want to say, a preacher rather than a friend, you could possibly lose people. You also want to go alongside of them. You want to be a friend. You want to be the guide. You're on the same journey. You're just a little bit ahead. My analogy for this is like when people are writing a book. Most people start at the bottom of the mountain, looking at this giant thing, having no idea how easy it really is, because it seems daunting, because it seems like it's multifaceted, and it is. So from the bottom looking up, it's overwhelming and it's overshadowing you. But when a guide comes alongside of you, who's already been up the mountain a few times, and they warn you about, oh, don't get too close to the edge over there. We've got this great viewpoint coming up ahead. And when you get to the top of the mountain with them, you celebrate. That is a more realistic type book than one where you're just speaking at a person and telling them what they should be doing. That's the key right there, is should. If you're telling them all the things they should be doing, you might want to reword a little bit and guide a little bit more rather than preach at them. Do start your chapters with attention-grabbing first sentences or stories or an incident that will capture their attention. If you start your story out and it is something like, I was born in 1954 in the beginning of the year in San Diego, California. I don't know about you, but I will probably glaze over because I feel that unless that's important to your story, maybe it is. If you're a 50s kid like I am, there was a lot going on in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in my youth, if you will. But if it's not important to the story, why would I need to tell you that? Certainly, you can weave certain facts about your life and how it influenced the decisions that you've made. but don't have to start in the very beginning. And please do something to pull the reader in, not kind of, if I can be honest, be boring. You don't want to be boring because they'll never get to page 2 if they get bored on page 1. Rather than to start out like that, you could say something more like, I never dreamed I would end up here at 45, sitting in a rented room alone. How on earth did I get here? This way, you're starting in the middle of your story, possibly, or maybe towards the end where you've learned a few things, but that you pull people in and wonder, okay, so why did she end up there? How did she end up there? What happened in the meanwhile? And what's so bad about sitting in a rented room alone? Well, it kind of paints a picture, doesn't it? You want to paint a picture with your story. That first one, where I was talking about I was born in 1954, is really all about me. You don't want your story to be all about you. You want your story to be professional and conversational, tell a story of transformation so that your reader can walk through it also. But you don't want to give so many details or paint a picture that isn't true. And I guess the final tip that I want to impart is make sure you are willing to get constructive feedback. And if I can be really honest, this is hard for me. I know it's hard for a lot of people. It's kind of like when you give birth to a baby. Nobody wants to hear that they're a conehead or that their head doesn't look quite right or they're not quite as beautiful as the mom is going to think they are, right? No, writing a book is a lot like having a baby. It is precious. It's your story. It's dear to you. And so if somebody, even if they say it in the most gentle ways, it's hard to take constructive feedback. But let me just say, it is essential to the success of your book. Because when we write our story, we think it's wonderful, we think it's perfect, we've worked really hard on it, but you might be missing some things. You could be missing something really valuable that will be brought out when somebody else reads it. They may get the impression that it is not as reader-oriented as it could be. So you definitely want to take all of these tips, do's and don'ts into consideration. And if by chance you would like a guide to lead you along the way, I'm excited to tell you that I am available for this. And I'm starting a new program to walk people through. It's actually an old program that I've revamped, and I'm getting ready to relaunch it. But in the month of November that I'm recording this video, I will be having some webinars coming up that will help you lay a firm foundation, including my webinar number 3, which is creating your best-selling campaign. These are all foundational webinars that are informational to help you make sure your book is on solid ground. Without that, you may not realize how your book could be so much better if I'm reading my notes and it says birth canal, and I went, oh my goodness, birth canal. I was making the analogy of giving birth to your book, and it does kind of go through some pushes and changes, and it's not easy, but it's possible. And you will have that beautiful baby at the very end. And if you do have a book, make sure you let me know so I can help post about it too. Thank you so much for being a part of the show. I so appreciate each and every one of you, and God bless.